A leaf falls from a branch. It twirls silently in the wind, drifting without purpose, or so it seems. You don't notice it at first. Why would you? It's just a leaf in just another moment, like the thousands of others that pass through your day. But what if it wasn't just a leaf? What if that single, quiet motion was part of something greater? A movement so vast, so intricate, it stretches beyond anything the human eye could trace. A stranger smiles as you pass on the sidewalk. No words are spoken. It's quick, casual. Maybe you smile back, maybe you don't. And just like that, gone. Another fleeting moment added to the pile of random things that happen today. We dismiss these moments so easily. We call them chance, coincidence, luck, good or bad. We say life is unpredictable, that the universe is chaos stitched together by accident. We think we're just passengers in a wild storm, riding waves we didn't create, headed somewhere we didn't choose. But that's only if we stop at the surface. Beneath that surface, something else is happening, something ancient, something alive. Something the Buddha saw over 2,500 years ago, beneath the stillness of a fig tree, when he pierced through the illusion of chaos and witnessed a truth deeper than philosophy, deeper than belief, a living pattern woven through all things. He didn't theorize this truth. He didn't construct it like a system of logic or metaphysics. He saw it directly, clearly, undeniably, and what he saw was this: nothing, absolutely nothing, stands alone. There is no moment that happens without a cause, no thought that appears without conditions, no breath that doesn't depend on countless invisible factors supporting it. Life is not randomness. It is relationship, not chaos but connection, not noise but rhythm. And that changes everything. Think about a ripple on water. It doesn't just appear from nowhere. Something touched the surface. A falling leaf, a breeze, a bird's wing. That ripple is the result of something else. And that something else was also caused by something else. And so on and so on. A chain so subtle, so delicate, we don't see the links until we slow down enough to feel them. So maybe the idea that everything is random isn't wisdom. Maybe it's just speed. Moving too fast to notice the invisible hands shaping our lives. Or noise, listening to so many voices, we can't hear the silent rhythm playing underneath them all. The Buddha didn't try to convince anyone with arguments. He simply invited people to see, to look at life just as it is. He saw that the falling of a leaf is not isolated. It's connected to the wind. The wind is connected to the weather. The weather is connected to the ocean. The ocean is moved by the moon. And the moon, well, the moon reflects the sun. Everything reflects everything else. No ripple exists by itself, and neither do we. Imagine the roots of trees in a forest. They touch, they communicate, they share nutrients. When one tree is sick, the others send help. They don't even know they're doing it. But they do. The forest isn't a collection of individuals. It's a living network where every life supports another, where the death of one leaf can nourish the birth of new life beneath the soil. This is the universe we live in, not a mechanical system, not a divine script, but a web, a dance of conditions. You smile at a stranger. They were thinking of ending their life today. Your smile, meaningless to you, echoes inside them like a bell in a dark cave. They go home. They sleep instead of acting. And they wake up to another chance, another day. You never knew, they never tell you, but a seed was planted, and a ripple traveled farther than your eyes could follow. Was that random, or was that the quiet law of interbeing? In Buddhism, this truth is called paticca samuppada, dependent origination. It means, when this is, that is. When this arises, that arises. When this ceases, that ceases. It sounds simple, but it changes the way you see everything. Nothing just happens. Everything happens because. And when you begin to live with that awareness, Even the smallest moment feels sacred. Even pain feels like a doorway. Even joy feels like a gift that's passed through countless hands before reaching you. So the next time you think your life is random, that your pain has no purpose, that your joy is meaningless, that your choices don't matter, stop, breathe, look again. You are not a passenger in a meaningless machine. You are part of a story unfolding in real time, written in the ink of wind, fire, water, thought, and choice. You are not separate from this universe. You are not just in the story. You are the story. And the truth is, stories don't write themselves. They're always shaped by moments, by motives, by minds. Yours is being shaped right now. So maybe it's time to stop calling it chance. Maybe it's time to stop seeing life as a lottery you either win or lose, and instead, to begin walking with the awareness that every step you take creates echoes in places you may never see. The Buddha never promised that life would be easy, but he did show us that it is never random. It only seems that way when we're not looking closely enough, but when we do, we begin to see the threads, we begin to see the design, and we begin to see our place within it, a place not of control, but of connection. So if life isn't random, then what is it? We look around and see billions of people, endless events, infinite choices. It seems chaotic, but just beneath the surface, there's a hidden rhythm, a silent pattern that has been guiding existence long before we were born. It's called interdependence. Nothing in this universe exists in isolation. Not a single thing. The tree outside your window, it breathes because of the sunlight, the rain, the soil, the earth's rotation, and even the carbon dioxide you exhale. You exist because two people met, because food grows in distant lands, because the sun rose this morning and oxygen still fills your lungs. When the Buddha realized enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he didn't just see suffering, he saw the causes behind it. And even more importantly, he saw that nothing arises independently. Every thought, every experience, every person is conditioned. That is the heart of the Buddhist teaching of Pratityasamutpada, the law of dependent origination. In simple terms, everything is connected and nothing stands alone. That heartbreak you went through, it wasn't just because of them. It was also about how you were raised, how you loved, how you feared being left. Layers upon layers. Like a spider's web, pull one thread and everything moves. And here's the stunning truth. Because things depend on conditions to exist, when those conditions change, the experience also changes. That's why no emotion lasts forever. That's why pain doesn't define you. That's why your current situation, no matter how stuck it feels, isn't permanent. Imagine holding a flame. That fire needs fuel, oxygen, and a spark. Remove even one of them and the fire dies. Your suffering, same principle, it needs fuel, a memory, a belief, a fear. But when you see the conditions that feed it and gently change them, you don't have to fight the fire. You simply let it burn out. Isn't that powerful? We often blame ourselves when life goes wrong. Or worse, we blame others. But what if it's not about blame? What if it's about seeing clearly, recognizing that every situation is a web of causes and effects? That your anxiety didn't just appear. It was woven from childhood pressure, future worry, and that one thing someone said that you never quite forgot. And this realization doesn't just help us understand suffering, it deepens compassion. Because when you truly see that everything is interdependent, you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you begin to ask, what are the roots of this? And then, what conditions can I let go of? And eventually, what can I nurture instead? Think about it. The person who cuts you off in traffic, maybe they're rushing to the hospital. The coworker who snaps at you, maybe their home life is crumbling. The friend who drifted away, maybe they're drowning in their own inner storm. They are not just that kind of person. They are conditions, reactions, wounds, circumstances, just like you, just like me. Interdependence breaks the illusion of separateness. And once that illusion is gone, compassion flows naturally, not as a performance, but as a recognition. We are not so different. We are not so separate. We are all connected in this infinite dance. That's why the Buddha didn't teach escape. He taught understanding, because when you understand the links, how thoughts shape feelings, how choices create patterns, you don't just react anymore. You pause, you breathe. And in that pause, you find freedom, not control, but freedom. The freedom to respond instead of react. The freedom to transform suffering instead of transmitting it. The freedom to choose compassion, not out of moral superiority, but because you see yourself in others. And this changes everything. You begin to move through life with awareness. You see how the smile you give to a stranger might ripple into someone else's good day. How your silence during someone's venting might save them from a breakdown. How the smallest shift in your own inner world might, one day, echo across generations. Because nothing exists alone, and once you truly see that, the world stops being a battlefield and becomes a web of sacred connections. So the next time you feel overwhelmed or alone, just pause, look around. Everything is speaking to you, supporting you, reflecting something in you. And when you see through the illusion of separateness, you're ready for something deeper, because if nothing exists by itself, then who are you really? Let's go further. Imagine standing beside a river. You dip your hand into the water and just as quickly it slips through your fingers. You try again and again. But no matter how tightly you try to grasp it, the water flows on, never the same, never stopping. This right here is the most accurate metaphor for life itself. Everything flows, nothing stays. That's not a poetic idea, it's the law. The Buddha once said, all compounded things are subject to decay. But what did he mean? It means nothing that's born, built, or formed can last forever. Not your body, not your possessions, not your youth, not even your thoughts or emotions. We live in a world that pretends permanence is possible. We buy things and build plans with the unspoken hope they'll stay just the way they are. We chase security, predictability, certainty. But if we look closely, if we become radically honest, we'll realize the world doesn't work like that. Take a look at the seasons. Winter turns into spring. Spring becomes summer. Summer yields to autumn. And then the cycle begins again. Not one leaf stays green forever. Not one snowflake refuses to melt. The world changes because change is what it is. Now look inward. How many thoughts have come and gone today? Joy, anxiety, peace, frustration, they don't stay. Your body, it's aging right now, cell by cell. Your relationships, constantly shifting. No matter how deep the bond, every friendship and love must someday face goodbye. Nothing is exempt, not the stars, not the mountains, not even you. But here's the twist. Impermanence isn't something to fear. It's the very thing that gives life its value. Think about it. If moments could last forever, would they be as beautiful? Would a sunset still take your breath away if you knew it would never fade? Would a child's laughter feel so precious if it echoed for all eternity? We cherish things because they're temporary. Fragility is what gives them meaning. The Buddha taught that clinging to what is passing brings suffering. And isn't that what we do? We cling to youth, hoping to pause time. We cling to people, pretending they won't leave or change. We even cling to our ideas of who we are, as if self is a permanent fixture rather than an ever-shifting pattern of thoughts, experiences, and memories. But impermanence isn't an enemy. It's an invitation. It invites us to show up fully for this breath, this conversation, this moment, because none of it will ever happen again. In the Zen tradition, a monk might spend an entire lifetime mastering the art of letting go. They understand that to grasp is to suffer, but to flow, to adapt, to surrender, to change, is to touch peace. Let's make this real. Imagine you've lost someone dear to you. The pain is unbearable. Your heart feels ripped apart. But what if, instead of seeing this as something going wrong, you understood it through the lens of impermanence? What if you realized that everything born must also end, and that love's beauty was never meant to be owned, only experienced? This isn't cold detachment. It's deep, profound acceptance. To accept impermanence is to finally breathe again. It's to stop fighting time. It's to love deeply, knowing the moment won't last. It's to release again and again, not because you don't care, but because you do. The Japanese art of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, it honors them. And in doing so, the bowl becomes even more beautiful because of what it's been through, not in spite of it. This is how we can live too. When your plans fall apart, remember, life was never meant to be fixed. When your dreams shift, realize you're evolving. When something ends, know that something else is already beginning. Everything flows, everything changes. But that doesn't mean it's all meaningless. In fact, it's the impermanence that makes it sacred. You see, when we start to truly see impermanence, we stop sleepwalking through life. We savor things. We speak kinder words. We forgive faster. We laugh more freely, because we know this moment will never return. So what's the takeaway? You can either resist change and suffer, or flow with it and be free. That's the law of life. And once you stop resisting, something beautiful happens. You stop needing everything to go your way. You stop panicking when plans shift. You become like water, flexible, adaptable, strong in your softness. And in that flowing state, you begin to understand something profound. If everything changes, then suffering too will pass. If nothing lasts, then every storm has an end. If life flows like a river, you don't have to build a dam. You just have to learn how to swim. Now, with this awareness, this reverence for the ever-changing nature of all things, we begin to glimpse a truth even deeper, something that connects every drop of this flowing river of life. Because if nothing stays the same, then what does that say about you? Let's go deeper. It's strange, isn't it? We cling so tightly to something we can't even define ourselves. We say, this is me, this is who I am. But if we really sit with this thought, what is this me exactly? Is it your name, your body, your memories, your beliefs, your preferences, your emotions? If you look carefully, you'll realize all of those change. Your body changes with age. Your thoughts evolve. Your emotions shift, sometimes by the hour. So how can something that's constantly changing be the core of who you are? Here's where the Buddha offered a teaching so radical, so unsettling, that it turns our entire worldview inside out. There is no fixed self, no eternal I. This doctrine is called anatta, non-self. At first, it can sound depressing, like you're being erased, but that's a misunderstanding. What the Buddha pointed to wasn't a nihilistic void, but freedom. Let me explain. Imagine you're holding onto a heavy identity. I am a failure. I am always anxious. I can't change. You repeat these things to yourself like mantras, as if they're carved in stone. But if there is no fixed self, then none of those stories are ultimately true. They're just passing clouds in the sky of awareness. Just as there's no permanent wave in the ocean, there's no unchanging person in the stream of life. Everything you call you is made up of processes, physical, mental, emotional, all interdependent, all in flux. This isn't just abstract philosophy, it's liberation in action. A monk once asked the Buddha, "Who suffers?" And the Buddha said, "Not who, but what arises and passes away." Pain arises, but there's no you to own it. Sadness comes and goes, but it doesn't define you. Even joy, beautiful as it is, isn't yours to possess. This is why anatta is considered one of the three marks of existence, along with impermanence and suffering. The illusion of a permanent self is the root of so much suffering. Because when we believe in a fixed me, we fear anything that threatens it. Criticism hurts, loss devastates, aging feels like decay. But when we see through the illusion, when we realize that the self is a flowing dance of causes and conditions, we're no longer trapped in the prison of ego. Think about this. Have you ever been so immersed in an activity, music, painting, walking in nature, that for a moment you disappeared? No worries, no labels, no identity. Just pure experience. That's a glimpse of anatta. It's not the absence of being. It's the absence of the cage. And from this freedom, something remarkable happens. Compassion arises. When you let go of your solid self, you also let go of the boundary between me and you. You see that others, too, are made of causes and conditions. Flowing, feeling, struggling just like you. The illusion drops. And what's left is connection. In the Zen tradition, there's a phrase, no self, no problem. It doesn't mean life becomes easy, but it does mean suffering no longer sticks to you like glue. You become spacious, soft, free, and maybe, for the first time, you can finally breathe. Now that we've opened the door to the illusion of identity, let's look even deeper. Because if there's no self, and nothing is permanent, then what is real? What holds all of this together? To answer that, we must go beyond the illusion of control and explore one of the most mysterious forces in the universe. Not karma as punishment, but as a law far more intricate and elegant than we imagine. Let's step into that now. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to carry a kind of invisible momentum in life? Why kindness radiates around them like a magnetic field, while others, no matter how much they strive, always seem entangled in struggle? The answer lies in something deeper than mere circumstance. It lies in karma, not as superstition, but as a profound law of cause and effect rooted in both Buddhist philosophy and lived human experience. Karma is not punishment. It's not reward either. It's more accurate to think of karma as momentum born from intention. In fact, the Buddha himself said, Setnehem bhikkhave k a mm a letter 1e43 vadami. It is volition, monks, that I call karma. That single line changes everything. Karma doesn't come from what we do alone. It arises from the intention behind what we do. Think about it. Two people might perform the same outward action, say, giving money to someone in need. But if one gives to feel superior and the other out of genuine compassion, the inner seeds they plant are entirely different. One cultivates ego, the other plants the roots of empathy. Over time, those inner seeds bear fruits in the form of thoughts, habits, relationships, and ultimately, your entire destiny. So karma is not some divine spreadsheet where a cosmic judge tallies your good and bad deeds. It's a self-regulating system. It's like gravity for your mind. Every time you think, speak, or act, you're feeding a cycle. Each cycle creates a groove in your consciousness, a pattern that becomes easier to fall into next time. Angry today, a little easier to be angry tomorrow. Kind today, a little easier to be kind tomorrow. Before you know it, you've become the story you tell yourself every day. This is where the power of intention becomes almost magical. Because intention is creative force. It's the spark behind karma's flame. What you consistently intend, whether consciously or unconsciously, shapes the architecture of your life. Not instantly, but steadily, quietly, like water carving through stone. Now imagine waking up each day and becoming aware of your intentions. Not just what you do, but why you do it. When you offer someone forgiveness, is it because you genuinely wish them well or because you want to appear noble? When you say yes to someone, are you acting from love or fear? These micro-intentions are the architects of your karma. Here's the kicker. You're not bound by your past karma. The Buddha taught that karma is dynamic, not fixed. You can't undo what has already been set in motion, but you absolutely can steer the direction of what comes next. That's the true liberation. You are not a prisoner of fate. You're a participant in your becoming. Let's take an example. A person may have lived for decades with bitterness, constantly criticizing others, seeing life through a lens of scarcity. That karma has likely created loneliness, mistrust, and pain. But the moment that person genuinely chooses to see beauty in someone else, to speak a kind word, to feel gratitude, that moment plants an entirely new seed. It may be small, but it matters. A single candle can light a dark cave. One profound teaching of Zen Buddhism illustrates this. Not the wind, not the flag. The mind is moving. It's not the world that creates your suffering or joy. It's the movement of your own mind, moment to moment. When you direct your intention with mindfulness, you step out of the mechanical loop of habitual karma. You begin walking the path of conscious living. This is why meditation is so important in Buddhist practice. It's not just sitting silently. It's the act of refining your awareness, tuning into your mind's habitual patterns, and bringing the light of attention to your deepest intentions. In that quiet space, you can start planting different seeds, not from fear, not from craving, but from compassion and clarity. Some people ask, if everything is karma, does that mean I deserve my suffering? No. Buddhism doesn't teach blame, it teaches understanding. Karma isn't judgment, it's mechanics. When you understand how a machine works, you stop cursing it and start learning how to operate it. You realize, I've been pressing the wrong buttons. I can do it differently now. You are not doomed by your past intentions, but you are shaped by them. And the beautiful paradox is, the very awareness of this truth gives you the power to reshape your life. Every kind thought is a liberation. Every act of honesty is a turning point. Every moment you choose stillness over reactivity, compassion over resentment, mindfulness over habit, you are literally altering the course of your karmic future. So ask yourself, what kind of karma are you planting today? Not in grand gestures, but in your tone, your thoughts, your reactions when no one is watching. What intention is guiding you right now? Because here's the truth most people never realize. Your life is not random, it's responsive. The universe reflects not just what you want, but what you are. Change your intention, and the mirror of life reflects a different image. And once you truly understand this law, something shifts. You stop being a victim of circumstance. You stop waiting for better karma. You start becoming it. And that, my friend, is where the real power begins. Now let's explore something even deeper. Because if karma is the law, then what exactly is this game we're all caught in? Why do we keep returning to the same patterns, same lessons, same lives again and again? To understand that, we need to journey into the nature of rebirth and samsara, and what it truly means to break free. You are not the captain of this ship we call life. You are the sailor, the winds, not yours to command, the storms, they come uninvited, but the sails, you hold them, and that makes all the difference. Most of us spend our days trying to control everything. Our careers, relationships, health, even the tiny, fleeting emotions that drift through our hearts. But if you've ever truly lived, if you've loved and lost, if you've tried and failed, you know that control is mostly an illusion. No matter how tightly you grip the wheel, the ocean does what it wants. So, what does the Buddha teach us in the face of such unpredictability? He doesn't say, control it all. He says, influence it skillfully. Imagine this. A sailor cannot change the direction of the wind, but with a good sail, he can shift course. He can catch the breeze and move forward. He may not arrive where he planned, but he'll arrive where he's meant to be if he learns to read the sea. In Buddhist philosophy, this idea is deeply rooted in wise effort, one of the core principles of the Eightfold Path. Wise effort doesn't mean forcing outcomes. It means aligning yourself with causes and conditions that lead to wholesome results. It's planting the seed, watering it, and letting the sun do the rest. You see, suffering often comes from wanting the world to match your map, but the ocean has no obligation to follow your compass. The key is not to demand certainty, but to cultivate adaptability. Let's take a moment to reflect. Think of the last time something didn't go according to plan. Maybe you lost a job. Maybe a relationship ended. Maybe illness knocked on your door. In those moments, you couldn't control the storm. But did you notice what remained within your power? Your breath, your response, your attitude. That pause before you react, that space is where your freedom lives. A Zen master once said, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." That's what this chapter is all about. There's a quiet strength in accepting that life doesn't owe us predictability. There's peace in understanding that our role is not to command the universe, but to coexist with it skillfully. This mindset changes everything. When you face uncertainty, you stop seeing it as chaos. You begin to see it as potential. Each moment becomes an opportunity to adjust your sail. And here's the real paradox. The more you surrender the need to control, the more influence you gain over your own experience. Why? Because you're no longer fighting the tide. You're flowing with it. Even modern science supports this ancient view. In psychology, this is known as the locus of control. People who believe they can influence, but not dictate, outcomes tend to be more resilient, less anxious, and more fulfilled. The Buddha didn't need neuroscience to know this. He lived it. In the Pali Canon, there's a moment when the Buddha is asked, "Do you control the world?" And he answers with a smile, "I do not control even my own body. It ages, sickens, and will die, but I have trained my mind." That's the essence. You can't hold back the aging. You can't command the stock market. You can't make people stay or love you forever. But you can train your mind to meet life with clarity, with kindness, with courage. Just like the sailor who doesn't scream at the storm. You learn to adjust your sails and ride it out. And you begin to trust that though you aren't in control of everything, you are in partnership with something greater. Maybe that's karma. Maybe that's cause and effect. Maybe that's the Tao, the Dharma, or simply the rhythm of life. Call it what you want, but once you stop trying to fight the tide, you finally learn to float. And when you float, something magical happens. You begin to feel supported by the very ocean you feared. Now, with this newfound clarity and surrender, let's explore something deeper. If we are not the ones in control, and yet our choices ripple outward, what happens when we stop clinging to outcomes altogether? What lies beyond craving, beyond fear, beyond the self that seeks to own and control? Let's go there. There's a moment that most people miss. A fraction of a second, a breath, a pause between what happens to us and how we respond. That tiny space, silent, fleeting, yet powerful, is where our freedom lives. Imagine you're walking down the street and someone bumps into you hard. Your knee-jerk reaction might be anger. You want to shout, push back, defend your dignity. But if you're mindful, truly present, you might notice something deeper. You might catch that moment before the fire rises. You might see the irritation, observe it, then let it go like an autumn leaf drifting downstream. That is the space between stimulus and response. And that space changes everything. Buddhism calls it sati, mindfulness. Not just being aware of your surroundings, but being radically honest with what's unfolding within. Your thoughts, your impulses, your fears. It's standing still in a storm and watching without panic as the wind howls through you. It doesn't mean you become passive. Quite the opposite. Mindfulness gives you choice. It gives you the power to respond, not react. You begin to live deliberately, not automatically. And that's where true freedom begins. Most of us live like puppets pulled by unseen strings. The string of craving, the string of fear, the string of memory, the string of habit. But when you become aware of those strings, when you watch your mind instead of being trapped inside it, something incredible happens. You can start cutting those strings, one by one. This is the training of the mind the Buddha spoke about. To be awake in every moment, to observe without clinging, to live with full awareness of now, not the shadow of the past or the anxiety of the future. Take a simple breath. Right now, don't try to change it. Don't label it, just feel it. Notice how the air brushes your nostrils. Notice the rise and fall of your chest. In this moment, there is no fear, no anger, no sorrow, just breath, just life. This is the doorway to liberation. When you practice mindfulness, you're no longer driven by unconscious conditioning. You start seeing how thoughts are not facts, emotions are not commands, sensations are not enemies. You see clearly, and with that clarity comes peace. Even in chaos, even in loss, even in the inevitable pain of being human, mindfulness doesn't eliminate suffering, but it transforms your relationship with it. Instead of drowning in emotion, you float above it. Instead of resisting pain, you embrace it with compassion. And instead of grasping for control, you settle into the vast, still ocean of awareness. It's not easy, but it's simple. And with each breath, each present moment, you reclaim your life. No longer a slave to reactivity, no longer trapped in illusions. You begin to live, not just exist. And slowly, something magical begins to happen. You discover that happiness was never about chasing after things or avoiding discomfort. It was always about being here, fully, now. That's the power of the space between, and it's always there, waiting for you to enter. Have you ever felt that the universe was listening? You think of someone and they call. You hold a deep desire quietly in your heart, and suddenly the right opportunity appears. It's easy to brush this off as coincidence, but what if it's not? What if the universe isn't a chaotic storm of unrelated events, but a vast, subtle rhythm that echoes back what you send into it? Because here's the truth. The universe doesn't speak in words. It speaks in patterns. It speaks in energy. And most of all, it speaks in response. We've come this far realizing how nothing exists on its own, that everything flows, and that even the self we cling to is an illusion. But now, we arrive at something deeper, a silent agreement, a whisper behind all motion. It's the rhythm of life itself, the dance of cause and effect, intention and echo. This rhythm doesn't obey your demands, it doesn't follow your clock, but it always listens. When you plant a seed, you don't scream at the soil. You water it, you tend it, you wait, and one day it sprouts. This is how the universe responds, not instantly but faithfully. In Buddhist cosmology, this rhythm is embedded in the fabric of reality. What you do, what you think, what you hold in your heart, these are not just internal experiences. They're signals, vibrations, waves in the ocean of cause and effect. And the universe is a perfect mirror. Anger out, anger in. Peace out, peace in. Not as punishment or reward, but as rhythm. The Buddha once said, "With our thoughts we make the world." Not just metaphorically, but quite literally. Your thoughts shape your emotional field, your perception, your behavior. And your behavior shapes your future. The universe doesn't give you what you want, it gives you what you are. You become what you repeatedly believe. You attract what you consistently feel. And you influence what you are deeply aligned with. If your internal world is full of lack, fear, or bitterness, You will interpret everything around you through that filter. And guess what? That very perception will subtly influence your decisions, your relationships, and your outcomes, perpetuating the very cycle you wish to escape. But shift the rhythm within, and the dance changes. You begin to notice different opportunities. People respond to you differently. Life starts to soften around the edges. You realize the universe isn't cold and indifferent. It's exquisitely tuned, like a symphony waiting for your part to harmonize. This is not magical thinking. This is awareness. You've seen this before in your own life, haven't you? Think back to a time when you were deeply aligned, when you felt clarity, love, courage. Didn't things just flow better? It wasn't because the world changed. It's because you changed your rhythm, and the universe responded. This is the secret the ancients whispered, and what modern quantum physics now echoes. The observer is not separate from the observed. Your state of being is not a byproduct of the world. It is a creative force within it. So no, life is not random. It may feel that way when we're disconnected, when we're rushing, doubting, or trying to control outcomes. But tune in, slow down, and listen closely, and you'll hear it. The pulse, the pattern, the rhythm of something vast yet intimate, something that moves with you, not against you. So how do we step into that rhythm? How do we respond to life in a way that invites harmony rather than resistance? That answer lies not in striving harder, but in softening, in listening, in aligning, and most of all, in embracing the silence between moments. Because it's in that silence where everything begins to shift. Let's explore that silence next. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a vast garden stretching endlessly in every direction. You stand at the center of it, holding a small seed in your palm. The soil is fertile. The sun is warm. The rain falls when needed. But the question is, what kind of seed will you choose to plant? This isn't just poetic imagery. This is how life really works. In the ancient Buddhist view, and more importantly in lived human experience, you are not a passive observer of your life. You are its gardener. Every thought you water, every habit you nourish, every word you speak is a seed cast into the soil of your own becoming. You may not control the weather, the insects, or how fast things grow, but the choice of seed, that is entirely yours. We often live as if we are victims of fate, as though the winds of life blow us around without our consent. But Buddhism tells a different story. It says, your intention is everything. More than mere action, it is the quality of mind behind what you do that shapes your path forward. Like a seed contains the blueprint of a tree, your intention carries the blueprint of your destiny. When your intention is rooted in greed, fear, or pride, the fruit will reflect that. When your intention comes from compassion, clarity, and equanimity, life begins to bloom in extraordinary ways, not always easy, but always aligned. This isn't about magical thinking. It's about cause and effect, karma in its most honest and practical sense. Every time you choose kindness over cruelty, patience over reaction, forgiveness over revenge, you are reprogramming the soil of your life. Every small gesture, if it comes from the right place, is an offering to the universe. And the universe listens. Imagine two people waking up each day. One begins with anxiety. Their mind immediately jumps to what could go wrong. Their inner monologue is filled with blame, scarcity, and fear. They move through the day reactive, defensive, disconnected. The other wakes up with a pause. They breathe. They feel grateful for being alive. Their intention, though subtle, is clear. Today, I choose to respond rather than react, to listen more than speak, to plant seeds I'm proud of. That single choice may seem small, but over days, months, and years, it rewires the entire garden of their life. Intentions are not goals, they are not checklists, they are deeper. They are the why beneath your actions. And in a universe governed by rhythm and connection, that why is powerful. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to plant the right seeds consistently. But here's the truth most people avoid. You are always planting something, whether you know it or not. Even your laziness is a seed. Your sarcasm is a seed. Your judgments, your distractions, your scrolling, your silence, all of it contributes to the shape of your character, the energy you emit, and the life you cultivate. So the only question is, are you planting consciously or unconsciously? You don't need to predict the future. You just need to take care of the present soil. Intention is the silent architect of your reality. When you're mindful of what you're sowing, the universe begins to reflect back to you the garden you're tending. And the best part, every moment is a new planting season. It doesn't matter what you planted last year. You may have cultivated anger, fear, or pain. But today, right now, you can reach into your pocket and choose a new seed. You can water presence. You can nurture truth. You can prune away what's dead and let in the light. Some people chase miracles. Others realize the miracle is the soil itself and our ability to shape what grows in it. So, as you walk through your garden today, ask yourself, what am I watering? Because your life is not just happening to you. You're growing it, seed by seed, word by word, breath by breath. And the rhythm of the universe, always listening, responds not to your demands but to your intention. Let's keep walking, because just ahead something even deeper is unfolding, a hidden order to it all. Not chaos but music. A universe that may not be random after all. Let's explore that rhythm next. There's a quiet moment when the wind stops, the sky softens, and something deep inside you whispers, not in words but in a knowing. It's the kind of moment when life no longer feels like a battle to win, but a mystery to live. All this time, you've been walking through the universe as if it were a stranger. But maybe, just maybe, the universe has been walking with you too, waiting for the moment you finally noticed. Everything we've uncovered, interdependence, impermanence, non-self, karma, mindfulness, points to one gentle truth. You are not here by accident. You are a thread in this vast tapestry, and even though you cannot control how the wind blows, you can still raise your sail. You can still choose how you show up, how you respond, how you plant your seeds. Many ask, if I have no control, what's the point? The point is not control. The point is presence. The point is walking this path with eyes wide open and hearts soft enough to feel the rhythm of life, to become intimate with the flow, to be still when needed, to act when called, and to love even when it hurts. No one else can walk this path for you. No teacher, no text, no tradition, but you can, not because you must, not because someone said so, but because you can. That is your freedom. That is your gift. Let go of the idea that life owes you clarity, fairness, or permanence. It doesn't, but it offers you something much more powerful, the chance to wake up again and again in each breath, each moment, each step. So walk the path. Not for enlightenment, not for perfection. Walk it because it's yours. Walk it because you are alive, and that alone is a miracle. Walk it because somewhere deep down, you already are what you're seeking. And now, before we close, if this resonated with you, if something stirred inside, even just a little, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. We create this space for souls like yours, who long for truth, stillness, and the courage to live awake. Let these teachings gently accompany your journey, one step at a time, one breath at a time. Until then, may your path be spacious, your heart be still, and your presence shine like a full moon over quiet waters.